Hello, my friend. Thank you for choosing to pause and listen with Sleepy Zen tonight. Out of all the places you could be, the fact that you are here in this moment already feels gentle enough. Tonight we will listen together to some very soft Buddhist teachings, resting quietly around something many people carry when night falls: the past. Old words, past mistakes, moments that could not be fixed in time, often return when the body is tired and the mind is ready to rest. Buddhism does not tell you that you must forget, and it does not ask you to forgive right away. It only gently reminds you that the past does not need to be carried into sleep. Before we begin tonight, stories, if it feels comfortable for you, you are welcome to share in the comments what time it is, where you are right now, and then let this night slow down. I will be sitting here with you. Emily lay on her side in bed, the room dim enough that things were no longer clear, but not dark enough to disappear completely. The familiar ceiling above her, the quiet hum of the air conditioner, and the small clock on the bedside table ticking in a slow, steady rhythm. Her body was tired after a long day. Her legs felt heavy. Her shoulders no longer wanted to hold themselves upright, and her eyelids were beginning to sink. But just as everything seemed about to settle, an old sentence appeared, strangely clear, as if it had been spoken only minutes ago. Emily was not trying to remember it, yet it arrived anyway, whole and intact, carrying the tone of voice and the gaze of someone from years ago, in a different room, from a long time past. The sentence itself was not long, not even especially harsh, but each time it returned, Emily felt a warm wave rise in her chest, followed by a slight tightening in her throat. She stayed still, barely moving, as if even the smallest shift might cause the memory to cling more tightly. She had tried many times to tell herself that it was over, that she had changed, that no one remembered anymore. But at night, those comforting thoughts often felt thin, while the old sentence felt dense, solid, and real. Emily slowly turned over and pulled the blanket a little higher. She was not as young as she used to be, no longer able to jump up and leave everything behind so easily. Time had passed long enough for her life to branch in many different directions. Yet somehow, when night fell, her mind still returned to that moment, like a short film stuck on repeat. Some nights she wondered whether she was punishing herself, or whether her mind had simply grown used to returning to a familiar place. She remembered that day clearly, not because it was special, but because of how ordinary it was. An afternoon, a sentence spoken without thinking, a moment no one prepared for. Back then, Emily had forced a small smile, tried to act as if everything was fine, and walked out of that room as though nothing had happened. But it seemed that some part of her had stayed behind, holding on to that sentence, tucking it away in a quiet corner, only to bring it out each night to examine, replay, and relive. Lying in the darkness, Emily suddenly noticed how tired her body truly was. Not the kind of tiredness that comes from physical effort, but a deeper exhaustion, as if her mind had been running for too long without ever being allowed to rest. She let out a long breath, not trying to control it, just allowing it to fall, heavy at first, then slower. The old sentence was still there, but this time, she did not rush to push it away. She simply looked at it from a distance, like a familiar object placed on a table, something she did not need to touch. Emily began to notice that each time the memory appeared, her body reacted before her thoughts did. Her shoulders lifted slightly, her jaw tightened, her heartbeat quickened just a bit. She had always thought the pain lived inside the memory itself, but now, lying still and watching, she realized that it was the act of reliving the moment that kept her body from resting. The memory on its own had no sound, no temperature, but when pulled into the present, it suddenly became vivid, as if everything were happening right now. The room remained quiet, unchanged, while only Emily's mind was moving. She did not try to fix anything, and she did not analyze. For the first time in many nights, she simply noticed that she was here, in this bed, at this hour. That old sentence belonged to a different time, a different place, a different version of herself. The thought did not arrive as a conclusion, but drifted through lightly, like a thin breeze. Emily did not fall asleep right away, but something inside her had slowed. The old sentence was still there, yet it no longer stood directly in front of her. It felt more like a distant echo, something that did not need an answer and did not need to continue. Her breathing grew steadier, deeper, and her body began to rediscover its true weight against the bed. In that moment, Emily had not let go of the past, but she had stopped pulling it into the present. And that alone, though small, was enough to make this night feel slightly different. She lay there a little longer, not trying to sleep and not trying to think. She noticed that when she stopped rushing to push the memory away, it began to fade on its own, like an image no longer lit by a projector. Her body was still here, on this familiar bed, in the quiet room of the present. That old sentence belonged somewhere else, to another time, and it did not need to be carried any further into this moment. The realization did not come through reasoning, but naturally, the way the body knows when it is time to breathe a little deeper. Emily gently placed a hand on her abdomen and felt her breath move in and out, slow and even. She saw that for many years, each night, she had unconsciously returned to the past, not because she wanted to hurt herself, but because her mind had grown accustomed to doing so. It was like a worn path, walked so many times that it felt familiar, even though it no longer led anywhere. When that thought arose, Emily did not blame herself. She simply felt a small sense of lightness, as if she had just set down something she no longer needed to carry. The old sentence still existed, but it no longer demanded a response. She did not need to explain herself again, did not need to prove that she had changed, and did not need to fix anything inside the memory. For the first time, Emily allowed that memory to remain in the past, where it belonged. And in doing so, the present moment quietly expanded, creating enough space for breath and exhaustion to rest. Her eyelids grew heavier, thoughts became more sparse, not disappearing entirely, but no longer pushing forward. Emily's body began to sink into the bed, as if it had just remembered that it was allowed to rest. In that drowsy moment, she did not need a promise for tomorrow, and she did not need a conclusion for the past. It was enough that this night felt gentler than the ones before. Emily's breathing softened and deepened. Sleep arrived not as a reward, but as something natural that happens when nothing is being held back. The old sentence had not vanished from her life, but tonight it did not come with her into sleep. And that, though very small, was a gentle release she had never allowed herself before. The quiet lesson began like a whisper, meant for anyone who has ever carried the past into bed each night. In Buddhism, there is a subtle distinction between memory and reliving. Memory is simply what has happened, resting in the past without weight. But when we pull a memory into the present, adding emotion, reaction, and self-blame, it becomes a source of exhaustion for the mind. The past itself does not hurt us. It is the act of reliving it in the present that prevents rest. Letting go here does not mean forgetting or denying what happened. It simply means not continuing to recreate it in each moment of now. When we notice that the body is here, tired and in need of rest, we begin to see that the past does not need to be carried into sleep. It does not need to be fixed, explained further, or given a new ending. Buddhism does not ask us to be firm or decisive. It gently reminds us that each moment has its own place. The past belongs to the past. The present belongs to this breath, and sleep belongs to softness. When we stop pulling what has already passed into now, the mind naturally finds more space to settle. And within that space, sleep does not need to be searched for. It arrives on its own, like an old friend who knows the way home. If tonight you are also carrying a sentence, an image, or a moment from the past, you do not need to do anything with it. Just notice that it does not need to come with you any further, at least for tonight. Then allow your body to rest, allow your mind to soften, and let sleep arrive in its own quiet way. Brother Theo lived in a small monastery nestled along a hillside, where evening arrived early and lingered gently. When the sun slipped fully behind the trees, the space grew so quiet that the sound of wind brushing against the wooden door could be heard before it faded away. Tonight was no different. After the evening chants, Brother Theo returned to his room and lit a small lamp, its light soft enough not to startle the darkness. On the old wooden desk lay the same object that had rested there for many years, a thin envelope without a name, not sealed, as if it were still waiting for something. The letter had been written long ago, during a time when Brother Theo was still someone else. Back then, he was unfamiliar with silence and did not yet know how to sit with emotions without explaining them. The letter was an apology, written after a misunderstanding, a careless sentence, a departure that had been too hurried. At first, he believed that sending the letter would settle everything, that the other person would read it, understand, and relief would follow. But day after day passed, and the letter remained on the desk, while Brother Theo slowly grew accustomed to its quiet presence. Each night before sleep, his eyes would pass over the envelope, not exactly looking at it, but knowing it was still there. Some nights he wondered whether he was avoiding something. Other nights, he thought perhaps the time simply was not right. As the years went by, life in the monastery became steady, and his mind grew calmer. Yet the letter remained unchanged, neither aging nor disappearing, like a neatly folded piece of the past waiting to be opened. Tonight, Brother Theo pulled out the chair and sat down at the desk, not to write more and not to read it again. He placed both hands on the tabletop and felt the coolness of the wood, its solid and quiet presence. The letter lay between his hands, so light it seemed to have almost no weight. He realized that all these years, what had kept him restless at night was not the content of the letter, but the belief that it needed to be sent for things to be complete. Brother Theo closed his eyes for a moment. He did not pray, and he did not search for answers. He simply sat there, in the quiet room, with the unsent letter, and a breath that was slowly easing. A very gentle thought appeared, not fully formed into words, more like a passing sensation that perhaps not everything unfinished needs to be resolved in the way we once imagined. He opened his eyes and looked at the envelope again. There was no urgency and no fear, only a strange calm. Brother Theo gently slid the letter to the side, not far, just enough so it was no longer directly in front of him. The gesture was small, but inside him, something quietly loosened. He stood up and turned off the lamp, allowing the room to return to its familiar darkness. Lying on his side in bed, his hands resting lightly on his abdomen, the letter was still there, in the room, and in his life, but it no longer lived in his mind as something that needed to be done right now. His breathing grew steadier and deeper, as if his body had recognized that nothing was waiting and nothing needed to be settled before rest. In the darkness, Brother Theo understood that on some nights, peace does not come from action, but from allowing oneself to do nothing at all. The unsent letter had not disappeared, but tonight it did not follow him into sleep. And that alone was enough to let the night pass more lightly, more quietly, like wind moving across the hill and dissolving into open space. The night continued in the familiar stillness of the monastery. Brother Theo did not fall asleep right away, but he no longer felt as though he were waiting for sleep to arrive. His body lay there, heavy in just the right way, as if it had been placed exactly where it belonged. In the darkness, he noticed that his mind was no longer circling around the letter. It still existed, still resting on the old wooden desk, but between it and him now was a gentle distance, not of space, but of release. In years past, whenever he thought of the letter, Brother Theo felt a subtle but persistent pull, as though an invisible thread tied him to what had already passed. He once believed that sending it would cause that thread to snap, but lying there tonight, he saw clearly that it was that belief itself that kept the thread intact. The idea that everything must be finished, must receive a response, must arrive at a clear ending, had kept his mind from ever truly resting. His breath slowed further, deepening naturally. He did not try to control it, only noticed that with each exhale, his shoulders softened a little more. The letter was no longer an apology that needed to be delivered, but simply an object resting quietly in the room. And for the first time, he allowed it to exist without assigning it a task. Nothing needed to be completed, fixed, or proven. A quiet and unfamiliar feeling arose, not quite relief, but something closer to acceptance. Acceptance that some relationships do not close the way we hope. Some words are never spoken at the right time, and some things do not need to be put back into order. In that moment, Brother Theo felt neither sadness nor regret, only a thin but genuine sense of calm. Sleep came to him like a light mist, without announcement and without being invited. The unsent letter was still there, but it was no longer the key keeping him awake. The night moved gently forward, not because something had been resolved, but because nothing was being held. The quiet lesson arrived slowly, like a reminder for anyone carrying unfinished things within them. In Buddhism, there is a deep understanding that not everything must be completed for the mind to be at peace. Some things appear unfinished, but in truth, they ended long ago. We simply have not allowed ourselves to let go. Many people believe that peace will come after doing one more thing, saying one more word, fixing one more mistake. Yet sometimes that belief itself prevents rest. We carry unsent letters, unfinished stories, conversations that exist only in our minds, and treat them as responsibilities of the present moment. Meanwhile, the body is already tired, night has already arrived, and sleep is waiting. Letting go here does not mean abandoning or avoiding. It simply means recognizing that some things no longer need our intervention. When we stop forcing everything toward a clear conclusion, the mind naturally finds more space to breathe. And in that space, peace does not need to be created. It is already there. The small lesson for you is this: not everything unfinished needs to be completed. Some things only need to be released. If tonight you are also carrying something undone, a word unsaid, or a letter never sent, you do not need to decide anything. Simply allow yourself to set it down, at least for tonight, so your body can rest, your mind can stop waiting, and sleep can arrive naturally when there is nothing left to hold. Master Rowan lived in a small hermitage set apart from the village familiar paths. The road leading up to it was not difficult to walk, but it was not inviting either. Those who came usually did so because they were carrying a question within them, heavy enough that it could not be set down in the middle of ordinary life. That afternoon, when the sunlight had softened and the wind had begun to cool, someone stopped at the porch of the hermitage, standing quietly for a long time before offering a greeting. This person was neither young nor old. Their face carried the traces of many years of thinking, and in their eyes lived a familiar hesitation. Sitting across from Master Rowan, they did not speak right away. It took some time before the question finally emerged, slow and careful, as if it had been rehearsed countless times in the mind. It was a question about an old mistake, a decision made in the past that had led to unwanted consequences. They wanted to know where they had gone wrong, whether there was a correct way to understand it, a way to stop the self-blame. Master Rowan listened without nodding and without interrupting. He sat very still, as though the question itself did not disturb the air around them. When the other person finished speaking, the silence lingered a little longer. A light breeze moved through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant birdsong. Then Master Rowan smiled, very gently, not a comforting smile, but the kind that comes from recognizing something long familiar. He did not answer right away. Instead, he asked another question, his voice slow and even. He asked how long this question had been carried. The other person hesitated, then said it had been many years, perhaps since the day the event occurred. Master Rowan nodded softly, as if this were entirely understandable. He did not say they were wrong, and he did not say that everything would be fine. He only said that some questions are once necessary, that they help us move through difficult times. But not every question needs to be carried forever. The other person fell silent. This response was not what they had expected. There was no explanation, no analysis of right and wrong. Just a very gentle observation that nevertheless caused something inside them to sink. They realized that for many years, they had lived with this question, carrying it into every night and every quiet moment, believing that only by finding a final answer could everything finally be at peace. Master Rowan stood and walked slowly behind the hermitage, where a small wind chime hung beneath the eaves. He lightly touched it, and the soft sound rang out, then quickly dissolved into the space around them. He said that the sound did not stay, not because it was unimportant, but because it had completed its task. The other person watched, feeling as though something inside them had been touched, even if they could not yet name it. When they left the hermitage, the old question was still there. It had not disappeared, had not been answered, and had not been closed with a clear conclusion. But it no longer stood directly in front of them. It felt like something that had once been necessary, that had once helped them understand themselves, but no longer needed to be repeated every day. On the path home, they walked more slowly than usual, not because of tiredness, but because nothing was pushing them to hurry. The question remained somewhere behind them, yet the present moment felt wider, quieter. And for the first time in many years, they realized that perhaps they did not need to answer anything more in order to be allowed to rest. They stepped off the dirt path leading to the hermitage as the evening light had fully faded. Their steps were unhurried, and there was no sense of carrying something heavy. The old question still existed in memory, but it no longer pushed itself forward. It was like a book that had once been essential to read during a certain period of life, now placed back on the shelf, not because it was wrong, but because it had completed its role. Night arrived gently. When they lay down, the familiar darkness of the room appeared. But, unlike nights before, The mind did not immediately return to the past. There was no repeated inner dialogue, no effort to find a better answer. Only the breath moving in and out, slow and steady, as if the body had realized it no longer needed to stay awake guarding anything. The image of Master Rowan standing by the hermitage porch, lightly touching the wind chime, appeared briefly and then faded. The sound left no trace, yet the moment it rang was complete. They suddenly understood that their question was the same. It had once been necessary, once guiding, once helping them survive a difficult chapter of life. But now, continuing to ask it no longer brought clarity, only pulled the mind back to places already past. Their eyelids grew heavy, not because something had been resolved, but because nothing needed to be held. Sleep arrived as a natural permission when the mind stopped demanding that it understand more, explain more, or find a perfect answer for what was already old. The quiet lesson arrived slowly, like a breeze passing over a lake after the ripples had settled. In Buddhism, wisdom is not always about finding the right answer. Sometimes, wisdom lies in recognizing that a question no longer fits the present moment. A question born from suffering can help us see that suffering clearly. But if we continue to carry it after the moment has changed, it becomes a burden. We often believe that understanding more will bring peace. Yet sometimes, peace opens when we stop trying to understand, when the mind keeps returning to what has already passed, asking questions that are no longer needed. It holds itself in a state of alertness, never allowing rest. Letting go here does not mean ignoring or denying past experience, but recognizing that the present no longer requires that answer in order to continue living. Some questions are meant to be asked during a certain phase of life, and then set down when that phase ends. When we allow ourselves to stop answering, stop analyzing, the mind naturally gains more space. In that space, quiet does not come from deeper understanding, but from no longer pulling the past into the present. The small lesson here is this: when the time has passed, the answer can be allowed to drift away. If tonight you are carrying a question that has been with you for a very long time, you do not need to erase it. Simply try setting it aside, the way you would set down something that was once useful. Then allow your breath to slow. Allow the night to hold you, and let sleep arrive when there is nothing left that needs to be explained. Evelyn woke very early, as she had for many years of baking, while the city was still wrapped in mist. The small bakery on the corner glowed with warm yellow light. She unlocked the door, took in a long breath of the familiar scent of flour, and began the slow movements her body knew by heart. Hands mixing dough, weighing sugar, warming the oven. Everything flowed as if it knew what to do without her needing to think. During the day, Evelyn was a steady baker, sure-handed, trusted by regular customers. But at night, when the shop was closed and the small room behind it grew quiet, an old memory often returned. It was the first batch of bread she had ever made on her own many years ago. Back then, Evelyn was young, impatient, and believed that trying hard enough would make everything turn out right. She had stayed up all night, preparing, measuring every ingredient carefully, following the recipe step by step. But when the bread came out of the oven, it had not risen properly. The crust had cracked, and the color was uneven. People had looked on, some shaking their heads, others making a careless joke, not meant to hurt, but enough to make her cheeks burn. Evelyn had forced a smile, cleaned up, and kept working. But from that night on, the failed batch never quite left her. Years passed, and Evelyn baked thousands of loaves. Some were wonderful. Some days the shop was so busy she barely had time to sit. People praised her bread for its warmth, its care, its feeling of patience. Yet strangely, when night came, those compliments did not stay. Instead, the memory of that failed batch from long ago returned, clearer than all the successes that followed. Tonight was no different. Evelyn lay in bed, listening to the wall clock ticking slowly. Her body ached after a long day by the oven, but her mind refused to settle. The image of the old batch appeared, along with the familiar sense of embarrassment, as if it had happened just yesterday. She realized she was reliving that moment, pulling it into the present, even though no one was there to judge, even though the bakery would open as usual tomorrow. Evelyn turned over and pulled the blanket a little higher. She wondered why such a small mistake from so long ago could cling to her so persistently. She had learned, improved, become a completely different baker. Yet the memory seemed uninterested in all of that. It only needed nightfall to return, like a habit repeated too many times. She slowly sat up, walked into the kitchen, and poured herself a glass of warm water. The dim light reflected off the glass, and in that moment, Evelyn noticed that the failed batch existed vividly in her mind, but nowhere else. There was no bread here, no watching eyes, no words of criticism, only her in the quiet house of the present. Evelyn returned to bed and set the glass down. She did not try to chase the memory away, and she did not comfort herself with explanations. She simply noticed how tired her body was and how the memory offered nothing to help it rest. The thought arrived lightly, not as advice, just as a gentle seeing. The failed batch from long ago was still part of her story, but tonight, it did not need to be carried any further. She lay back down, placed a hand on her belly, and felt her breath move in and out. The rhythm slowed, her shoulders softened. The old memory still hovered somewhere, but it no longer stood right in front of her. In the quiet, Evelyn began to feel the true weight of her body on the bed, and the night itself seemed a little gentler. She lay there a while longer, not trying to sleep and not trying to think. The memory of the old batch was still present, but no longer sharp. It carried no sound, no watching eyes, only a distant image, like an old photograph faded with time. She realized that for many years, the memory had stayed, not because it still mattered, but because she had grown used to carrying it. Her body gradually loosened in a very natural way, not because she had found a new perspective, and not because she had forgiven herself, simply because she stopped pulling that memory into the present. That failed batch belonged to a very distant morning, to a much earlier version of herself, and it did not need to come with her into sleep now. As that wordless understanding passed through, her shoulders softened a little more, and her breath slowed. Many years after that first batch, Evelyn had baked countless loaves. Some were excellent. Some days were so busy she barely paused. But tonight, for the first time, those successes did not need to be brought out to balance the old memory. No comparison was required. No trial needed to take place in her mind. Only the very real tiredness of her body, finally allowed to rest. Some memories remain, not because they still hold weight, but because we are used to holding them. Like a loaf baked long ago, no longer warm, no longer fragrant, yet still kept in our hands simply because we have never tried setting it down. When Evelyn stopped bringing that batch to bed with her each night, not to deny it, but to rest, her body began to feel safe. And within that safety, sleep did not need to be searched for. It arrived gently on its own. Evelyn's breathing grew steadier. Thoughts thinned out, not disappearing completely, but no longer pushing forward. She did not need a promise for tomorrow, and she did not need a conclusion for the past. Tonight did not need to heal anything. It only needed to pass more softly than the nights before. And that was enough. The small lesson did not arrive as an explanation, but like the warmth lingering in a kitchen long after the oven has been turned off. Some things do not need to be fully understood in order for us to rest. We only need to stop touching them one more time. When we stop returning to an old moment to measure the worth of the present, that memory naturally becomes lighter, like an object placed back where it belongs. Many people carry an old mistake as if it were the final proof of who they are. Each night, when everything grows quiet, the mind returns to that moment, repeating it, comparing it, asking why it was not done better. But the past does not need to be replayed to become lighter. It only needs to be left where it is. When we stop using yesterday to judge today, the mind begins to widen, not because something new appears, but because something old no longer takes up space. Letting go does not mean saying the old mistake did not matter. It simply means not allowing a moment that has passed to keep deciding how the present feels. When you allow yourself to be the person you are now, not named by an old memory, the mind no longer needs to strain to fix or prove anything. Everything is allowed to be as it is, unforced, untouched. And in that simplicity, the night becomes deep enough for both body and mind to rest together. The small lesson is this: an old mistake does not define who you are today. Olivia turned off her desk lamp, and the room settled into a familiar dim light. Everything had been put away early. The laptop closed, the phone placed face down on the table. There were no notifications waiting for her, no emails that needed an immediate reply. Her body felt tired in a very clear way, as if each part had finished its work for the day. But when Olivia lay down and closed her eyes, her mind did not slow at the same pace as her body. The old report appeared, not as a clear image, but as the familiar feeling of a mistake that had already happened. It was a report submitted late, long ago, an error that had been corrected, a meeting that had passed, an apology email that had already been sent. In reality, everything was finished. Yet every night, the memory returned, neat and punctual, as if it still had a task left undone. Olivia lay on her side and gently pulled the blanket higher. She no longer blamed herself harshly the way she once did. In recent years, she had learned to be gentler with herself. But strangely, that daytime kindness did not always follow her into the night. When there was nothing left to do, the mind opened old folders on its own, turning back to a page she thought had already been closed. She remembered the feeling clearly, not because the event was big, but because of the worry that lingered afterward. Olivia had feared being judged, feared being seen as careless, feared that a small mistake would become a lasting mark. Even though everything turned out fine, that fear stayed somewhere inside, like an old reflex that never quite faded. And tonight, it appeared again, quietly, but enough to keep her from fully relaxing. Olivia shifted her position, then stopped. She noticed she was trying to sleep, and that effort itself was making her body more tense. The old report was not on the desk, not in the computer, yet it occupied a very real space in her mind. She breathed out slowly, without any technique, simply allowing the breath to find its way down. A very gentle thought arose, not clearly formed into words, that perhaps the report had completed everything it ever needed to do a long time ago. It had been submitted, read, responded to, and filed away. Carrying it into the night did not make the past better, and it did not protect the present. The thought was not a conclusion, just a passing sensation, like realizing you are holding something that is no longer needed. Olivia's body began to feel a little heavier in a comforting way. She noticed that when she stopped replaying the old scene, her heartbeat slowed. There was nothing that needed fixing right now. No one was waiting for an answer. Only the night and a body that had done enough for today. The old report still existed as part of Olivia's professional story. It did not disappear, was not rewritten, and was not made more perfect in memory. But tonight, for the first time, it was no longer at the center. It was like a stack of papers placed back into a drawer, not locked away, but not opened either. Olivia did not fall asleep right away, but a small empty space appeared where familiar self-blame used to sit. In that space, she felt the surface of the bed, the warmth of the blanket, and the quiet of the room. Thoughts became fewer, not because they were pushed away, but because they were no longer being called forward. The night continued. There was no special sign that sleep was approaching. Only Olivia's body, slowly understanding that it no longer needed to stay awake guarding an old mistake. And when there was nothing left to protect or repair in the dark, rest found a place to appear, very softly, very slowly, as if it had always been there, simply waiting to be invited by this gentle release. Olivia lay still in the darkness, no longer searching for a more comfortable position. Her body was already where it belonged, on the familiar bed, in a room where all daytime sounds had faded. When there was nothing left to react to, she noticed the space around her seemed to widen slightly. Not because something new appeared, but because something had stopped taking up space. For many years, the old report had returned at night, not as a clear image, but as the familiar feeling of having once done something not quite well enough. During the day, Olivia rarely thought about it. Work continued. New projects came and went, and life did not pause because of a small mistake long since corrected. But at night, when there was nothing left to do, her mind automatically opened an old drawer. Perhaps at first, remembering had served as a reminder. It helped her be more careful, more attentive, less likely to repeat the mistake. But over time, that reminder no longer led to any new action. It simply remained as a reflex, keeping the mind in a state of alertness, as if letting go would cause everything to collapse. Her body had carried that feeling for far too long. Tonight, Olivia did not try to stop the thought. She also did not try to turn it into a more positive lesson. She simply noticed that the report had finished everything it needed to do long ago. Continuing to bring it into the night no longer served the present and did not protect tomorrow. Her breathing slowed naturally, without adjustment. When the body was no longer held tense by an invisible task, a sense of heaviness appeared, real and comfortable. Other thoughts still came and went, but none stayed long enough to pull her away from this moment. There was no question that needed answering. Nothing needed preparing right now. From here, the story was no longer about the report, but about something more familiar to many people. There are things that ended long ago, yet the mind continues to carry the feeling of needing to watch over them. Not because we are irresponsible, but because we have grown used to not allowing ourselves to rest. Prolonged self-blame can look like carefulness on the surface, but underneath, it is a habit that prevents the body from resting. When a mistake has been corrected, yet self-blame continues, it is no longer about responsibility. It is simply inertia of the mind, repeated long enough to feel familiar. And like any habit, it does not need to be fought to disappear. It only needs to stop being fed during the moments when the body needs to soften. There is no need to forget the old report, no need to turn it into a better story. It simply does not need to lie beside you in the dark each night. When that happens, there is no sudden realization, no bright moment of insight. Only a very ordinary settling, like releasing something you have held for too long and no longer remembering why you were gripping it so tightly in the first place. The small lesson is this: prolonged self-blame is not responsibility. It is a habit of the mind. Sister Arya arrived at the lake as dusk was settling in. The narrow path leading down to the water looked just as it always had, covered with fine soil and dry leaves, showing no sign of how much time had passed. She walked slowly, not from tiredness, but because this place naturally softened every movement. The lake opened before her, still and wide, reflecting the changing colors of the sky, while the trees around the shore stood quietly as if they were used to waiting. She had not returned here for a very long time, not because she was avoiding it, and not because she had forgotten. Life in the monastery had simply carried her along different rhythms, different mornings, different kinds of quiet. But tonight, without any clear reason, her steps led her back to the old lake, a place once tied to a memory that was not easy to name. Sister Arya spread her meditation mat on the grass near the water and sat down gently. She set no intention for this meditation. There was no question to be illuminated, and nothing that needed to be softened. She was simply sitting here, in a space that felt both familiar and distant, where the past had once left a clear mark. A breeze moved across the lake, forming small ripples that quickly faded, as if they had never appeared. Long ago, in this same place, she had once sat for a long time with a sadness she did not yet know how to name. Back then, Arya was new to monastic life, carrying many stories she had not yet set down. She believed that if she sat long enough, breathed deeply enough, and held her body still enough, the memory would leave on its own. But it did not. It stayed quietly, like the lake before her, not loud, yet not gone. Tonight, as she sat down, Sister Arya no longer expected anything from the lake. She did not use it as a mirror to look back at herself, and she did not hope it would bring a special feeling. She simply noticed that the water was still there, calm and unchanged, even though the story within her had shifted greatly. What once caused her heart to sway no longer held the same shape. She placed her hands on her thighs, her back upright without effort. The breath moved in and out, without counting. At times, an old image appeared briefly, then dissolved, like a thin cloud drifting across the evening sky. Sister Arya did not follow it, and she did not push it away. She noticed that the memory no longer carried the heaviness it once did. It was only an image, nothing more. The lake before her remained still. It did not react to what Arya was thinking or not thinking. It did not hold on to the ripples that had just passed. Looking at the water, Sister Arya suddenly saw clearly that this place had never held her. Only memory had done that. And when memory is no longer fed by constant return, it naturally grows thinner, more distant. The sky darkened gradually. Sounds around her became fewer, as if everything else was also preparing to rest. Sister Arya remained seated, her posture unchanged, yet the feeling in her body had shifted. There was no tension of waiting, and no old sadness needing to be worked through. Only the simple presence of someone sitting by a lake on an ordinary evening. When she stood, Arya glanced at the water once more. The lake was still, unchanged by her arrival and unchanged by her leaving. She realized that there are places once tied to the past, but the place itself never holds that past for us. Everything continues as it is, while the story inside us changes again and again. Sister Arya walked away, leaving the lake behind without carrying a sense of needing to close anything. The small path led her back as it always had, not asking what mood she arrived with, and not requiring her to be different when she left. In that simplicity, the evening passed more lightly, as if there were nothing more that needed to be held. She returned to the monastery after night had fully fallen. No special feeling followed her back, no clear sense of relief, and no named sadness. Only a very ordinary state, like entering a familiar room after a long day, with nothing that needed rearranging. She washed her hands, changed her clothes, and sat in her small room, allowing the darkness to settle on its own. The image of the lake passed through her mind now and then, but it no longer pulled old memories with it. It appeared simply as a place that existed, without a story that needed retelling. Arya noticed that for many years, she had believed she needed to avoid that place to avoid being pulled into the past. But tonight, having sat by the old lake without being drawn in, she saw clearly that it was memory that once held her, not the space itself. She lay down and let her body find its resting position. There was no intention to meditate and no intention to reflect. The breath moved naturally, without guidance. Small gaps appeared between thoughts, not long, but enough that the mind was no longer completely filled. In those gaps, Arya felt a very gentle quiet, not the result of effort, but the result of no longer trying to do anything more. When she was younger, Arya believed that returning to a place tied to sadness meant she would have to face it, process it, and let it go. But tonight, she understood in a very different way that space does not carry our stories. It simply exists, whole in itself. Only when we repeatedly bring memory back does it seem as though the place is holding us. Some memories no longer carry the same weight, yet we continue to treat them as if they do. We avoid places, avoid feelings, even avoid quiet evenings, afraid everything will return. But when Arya sat by the old lake without trying to change anything, she saw that memory does not revive itself unless it is called. It needs the mind return in order to continue living in the present. Tonight, sleep did not arrive quickly, but it arrived evenly. There was no clear moment of transition, only the feeling of the body gradually growing heavier, like setting an object back where it belongs. The lake, the memory, and the evening drifted into one wide space, where nothing needed to be kept separate anymore. The quiet understanding did not appear as an explanation, but as a natural settling. In Buddhism, there is a gentle recognition that places do not carry our past. Space does not hold our stories, does not hold our sorrow, and does not hold us. Only memory, when repeated often enough, creates the feeling of being held. When memory is no longer fed by constant return, it naturally thins and fades, like mist dissolving with morning light. Letting go here does not mean forgetting what once happened, but allowing the present to exist without being covered by old layers. When we stop assigning a place the responsibility of bringing back feelings, the mind begins to widen. And in that openness, the body no longer needs to stay tense and alert, as if it has finally been allowed to rest in this moment. The small lesson is this: old spaces do not hold you, only memory does. Everything continues to move slowly, without needing a clear ending. The night grows deep enough to blur the line between what has passed and what is. And in that simplicity, rest finds a place to remain without needing to be named and without needing to be held any longer. Jonas still kept that wooden table in his workshop, even though it was no longer used very often. It stood against the north wall, where the afternoon light came in slowly and at an angle, just enough to reveal the grain of the wood. The table had been with him since his earliest days as a carpenter, when everything was clumsy and his hands had not yet learned precision. On its surface, there was a long scratch, not deep, but clear enough that it could not be missed when standing nearby. In the past, Jonas had been deeply bothered by that scratch. Each time he wiped the table, his eyes would linger there a little longer, as if it were a quiet reminder of his carelessness. The scratch appeared on a rushed afternoon, when he tried to finish the work faster than usual. A knife slipped slightly, a brief moment of lost focus, and the mark stayed. No one else noticed, but Jonas did. Years passed, and his craftsmanship changed greatly. The tables and chairs he made became stronger, more beautiful. People came to his workshop for its care and reliability. Yet strangely, the old scratch on that table often returned in his thoughts, especially when the workshop was empty and there was nothing that needed to be done. This afternoon, Jonas stood alone in the shop, no music playing, no windows open. The air was so quiet, he could hear the wood contracting softly. He placed his hand on the tabletop, not to fix it, and not to hide the scratch. Just resting his hand there, feeling the familiar surface worn smooth by time. The scratch was still there, unchanged, but his feeling toward it was different. Jonas realized that it had been a long time since he had thought about making this table perfect. It had finished its role long ago, supporting countless pieces of wood, bearing enough weight during the years he was still learning his craft. The scratch did not weaken the table, and it did not make his work worse. It was simply a mark of time, like the many marks on his own hands. He stood there for a while, without thinking further. The afternoon light touched the surface of the table, making the scratch stand out, then fade again as clouds passed. Jonas noticed that the scratch itself never changed with the light, only the way he looked at it did. Some days it appeared very clear. Other days he almost forgot it was there. And that had nothing to do with the table, but everything to do with his inner state. When Jonas left the workshop, he did not turn back to look at the table again. Not out of avoidance, but because there was no longer a reason to check. The scratch remained, as it always had, but it no longer carried the feeling that something needed to be fixed. In the quiet of the late afternoon, his body felt a little lighter. Not because anything had disappeared, but because something had stopped being a problem. Evening arrived slowly in Jonas' workshop. When he returned home, the faint smell of wood still clung to his clothes, so familiar it barely needed notice. He washed his hands, letting water run over old calluses, then sat by the window, where the streetlight shone just enough to keep the room from going completely dark. There was no heavy fatigue, and no thought that something needed to be completed. Just a day closing in a very ordinary way. The image of the wooden table passed through his mind, but this time without the familiar irritation. The scratch was still there, just as clear as it had always been, yet it no longer triggered a response. Jonas realized that for a long time, he had treated that scratch as an unfixed mistake. Even though it had never caused him to fail at his work, and had never made any table he built afterward less sound. He lay down and felt his back meet the bed, sensing his body weight slowly spread out. There were marks on his own body he had never thought of erasing. Small scars, hardened skin on his palms, faint lines at the corners of his eyes. They had been there for a long time, asking for nothing, making no noise. Only the scratch on the wooden table had been given a meaning larger than itself. In the stillness of the evening, Jonas saw clearly that a mark that no longer causes pain does not need to disappear. it can remain as part of the surface, not deep, not new, no longer affecting anything. When we keep touching it with self-blame, it becomes alive again. But when we stop doing that, it is simply an old line in the wood, resting where it belongs. Sleep did not come immediately, but his mind no longer circled around the idea that everything needed to be made more complete. No table needed to be perfect for tomorrow to begin. No scratch needed to be erased for him to continue his work. Jonah's body understood this even before his mind could name it. The quiet lesson dissolved gently, like the soft sound of wood settling as night falls. Some marks remain long after the pain they once carried is gone. But their presence does not mean they are still hurting us. When we stop seeing a mark as proof of failure, it loses the power to define how the present feels. It remains, but it is no longer at the center. In Buddhism, letting go does not always mean making things disappear. Sometimes, letting go simply means allowing a mark to exist without reacting to it. When the mind no longer returns to check, judge, or repair, the body begins to feel safe. And within that sense of safety, rest appears, not because something has been completed, but because there is nothing left that needs to be done. The small lesson is this: the presence of a mark does not mean the wound still hurts. Everything continues to move slowly, like the wooden table standing quietly in the workshop after the lights have gone out, needing neither to be hidden nor repaired. And in that stillness, the night is wide enough to hold everything that remains, without asking it to change any further. Grandpa Ellis still kept the habit of walking to the lakeside each evening, even though the path had grown much quieter than it once was. He walked slowly, not because of age, but because there was no longer any reason to hurry. The old wooden bench waited beneath the willow tree, facing the water where the moon often rose late and gently. He sat down, hands resting on his knees, looking out at the still lake, as if he had learned how to wait without needing to name it. Long ago, in this same place, someone used to come with him. They did not talk much. They simply sat, watched the moon rise, listened to the wind skim across the water, and left when the night had grown deep. There was no planning and no reason needed. That presence had once been such a natural part of the evening that Grandpa Ellis did not realize how much it mattered until it was gone. That person had not come for a very long time. There was no single evening that marked the last visit. One day, the chair beside him simply stopped being pulled out. In the evenings that followed, Grandpa Ellis still sat, still watched the moon, and still left that familiar space open. At first, he thought it was only habit that had not yet faded, but over time, he realized that he was waiting quietly, without saying it, without expecting anything clear. Tonight, the moon rose slowly. Its silver light spread gently across the water, unhurried, not trying to illuminate anything in particular. Grandpa Ellis sat quietly, carrying no specific memory, only the familiar feeling that someone had once been here. The empty space beside him remained, but it no longer carried tension. It was simply an empty seat, nothing more. He noticed that for a long time, he had not only missed that person, but had also been waiting for them to return. Even while knowing, deep down, that they would not. That waiting was very quiet, not sharp with pain, but persistent enough to keep the evening from ever fully closing. When he noticed this, Grandpa Ellis did not feel sad. He felt only a gentle tiredness, as if he had been holding something for too long without needing to. A soft breeze moved across the lake, sending small ripples outward before they quickly disappeared. Grandpa Ellis watched, without thinking further. He suddenly saw that the moon still rose each night, whether someone sat beside him or not. The lake remained calm, the willow tree stood still, and the evening continued in its own way. Nothing in this scene required the presence of the one who no longer came. He stood up slowly, neither rushing away nor lingering. The empty bench remained where it was, not pulled closer and not taken away. Grandpa Ellis turned from the lake and followed the familiar path, carrying a very light feeling that tonight he did not need to wait for anything more. He returned home as the night deepened. The door closed behind him with a soft sound, as if the house itself had learned not to make noise. He hung his coat on the old wooden hook, his movements slow, not from fatigue, but from having no reason to rush. In the small room, the warm lamp light spread just enough for things to exist without needing to be clear. He sat in his familiar chair and looked toward the darkened window. The image of the lakeside and the empty bench no longer appeared as sharply as before. In its place was a strange feeling, not quite sadness, and not relief either. It felt like realizing that one has walked a familiar road for a very long time, and tonight, for the first time, did not need to look back. For many years, Grandpa Ellis had carried two things at once. One was the memory of the person who once sat beside him, warm and real. The other was a quiet, steady waiting that one evening the empty bench would be filled again. He never named that waiting, never called it hope, and never called it sorrow. It simply existed as part of the evening, inseparable from it. But tonight, when he stood and left the lakeside, he realized that he had stopped doing one very small thing. He had stopped leaving space with the idea that it needed to be filled. The empty bench was still there, but it no longer carried an unspoken promise. It was simply a bench beneath a tree, beside a lake that continued to reflect the moon. Grandpa Ellis' body softened as he lay down. There was no sense of emptiness spreading, and no return of loss. Only a very gentle calm, like releasing a rope that had been held for so long, one no longer remembered gripping it. His breathing slowed and evened out, without needing attention. The memory of that person did not disappear. It remained, like an old photograph placed in a familiar drawer. But it no longer carried the questions of when or whether. Without waiting attached to it, the memory naturally grew lighter. It no longer asked the present to stay open for something that would not come. The quiet lesson dissolved slowly, like moonlight dimming as clouds pass. Some connections do not exhaust us, but silent waiting does. When we hold an empty space with the hope that it will be filled, we unknowingly keep ourselves living beside the past. Letting go here does not mean forgetting someone, but stopping the act of waiting for them to return so the present can be whole. When Grandpa Ellis stopped waiting, the evening no longer stretched itself out. It became an ordinary evening again, with moonlight, a soft breeze, and a familiar path leading home. And in that ordinariness, the body no longer needed to stay awake, guarding something that was no longer necessary. The small lesson is this: letting go is not forgetting someone, but stopping the wait for them to come back. Everything slowly settles without needing another thought. The night grows deep enough to hold what remains, and wide enough to ask nothing to return to how it once was. Lydia opened the wooden storage door in the late afternoon, when the sunlight had already softened and was no longer strong enough to illuminate everything clearly. The small shed behind her lantern workshop was rarely opened, since most of what she needed was kept out front. There was no particular reason she stepped inside today, only a vague sense that something needed to be seen again, and then left alone. The quiet smell of old wood and metal drifted out as the door opened. Lantern frames hung along the wall, neatly arranged, but lightly dusted. Lydia moved slowly, her hand brushing the shelves, without searching for anything specific, until she noticed it, a small lantern resting low in the corner, not carefully wrapped like the others. Its frame had darkened with age, the paper inside slightly stained, yet its shape remained intact. The lantern had been made long ago, during a time Lydia did not often wish to revisit. It was for a small festival where things had not turned out as hoped. She had made the lantern with great expectation, believing its light would be enough to change that night. But the festival ended early. Rain arrived without warning, and the lantern was barely ever lit. Afterward, Lydia brought it back to the storage room, placed it in the corner, and did not open it again. She lifted the lantern and felt its familiar weight in her hands. No clear sadness arose, only a slight heaviness, like touching something once filled with expectation. Lydia noticed that she had avoided this lantern, not because it was broken, but because it reminded her of an evening that had not unfolded as planned. She carried it outside and set it on the wooden table in front of the workshop. The fading daylight passed through the thin paper, making the lantern appear gentler than it had in her memory. Lydia did not light it. She simply sat there and looked at it, as one might look at something that had completed its role long ago, even if that role had not been to shine. Over the years, Lydia had made many other lanterns. Some were lit during joyful nights, others were used only once and then stored away. Yet this old lantern held a particular place, not because it was more beautiful, but because it was tied to a moment when she had hoped deeply. And it was that unfulfilled hope that had made her unwilling to look back. The afternoon faded further. Lydia sat quietly, not thinking of fixing the lantern and not thinking of throwing it away. She realized she did not need to do anything with it right now. The lantern had been completed long ago. It did not need to be lit again to prove anything. It was simply here, in a quiet afternoon, asking for no new purpose. Lydia stood and placed the lantern on a low shelf inside the workshop, where natural light could still reach it, not to display it and not to use it, but simply so it was no longer hidden away in storage. When she turned to leave, there was no feeling of closing something, and no sense of opening anything either. Just a very gentle movement, like setting an object back where it belonged. When night fully arrived, Lydia closed the workshop earlier than usual. The old lantern remained there on the low shelf, unlit and unhidden. It rested in the dim evening light, not demanding attention, not loudly recalling the festival from years ago as she once feared it would. She glanced at it once more before turning off the lights, then walked away with a quiet sense that nothing more was required of her. In the small house behind the workshop, Lydia poured herself a cup of warm water and sat down, allowing the darkness to fill the corners of the room. The image of the lantern passed through her mind, but it did not bring regret or a desire to fix anything. It was simply there, like something that had completed its role, even if that role was different from what she had once hoped. For a long time, Lydia believed that painful memories needed to be revisited, needed to be lit up again before they could be set down. But tonight, she realized that not every memory needs to be illuminated. Some things only need to be seen once and then allowed to rest in the dark where they no longer glare. Her body gradually softened as she lay down. There was no feeling of emptiness and no clear sense of closure. Just an evening passing in a very ordinary way. The old lantern from the storage room was no longer hidden, but it was not the center of the room either. It was in its place, no more and no less. The quiet reflection did not arrive as an explanation, but as a slow-moving thought. In Buddhism, letting go does not always mean discarding or forgetting. Sometimes, letting go simply means not relighting a memory each time night falls. When we stop doing that, the memory still exists, but it no longer takes up the space of the present. Some objects are made for a moment that has already passed. They do not need to be used again to prove that we once hoped, once waited, once felt disappointed. They only need to be allowed to rest, uncalled, undisturbed. When there is no longer a need to make every memory bright, the mind begins to soften, like eyes adjusting to darkness and no longer asking for more light. The small lesson is this: not every memory needs to be relit. Everything continues to move slowly, like the lantern standing quietly in the workshop as the night deepens. Neither lit nor extinguished, simply present in just the right way. And in that rightness, the night has room to hold the body and allow everything to settle, gently, gradually, until there is nothing more that needs to be remembered. Uncle Reed stopped at the old fork in the road on a softly fading afternoon. The dirt path stretched ahead, curving gently past low trees before disappearing around a familiar bend. He had not walked this road in many years, not because he had forgotten it, but because life had carried him in another direction long ago. Today, there was no clear reason for stopping. His steps simply slowed, and his eyes naturally followed the trail that had once been so familiar. Long ago, Uncle Reed believed that if he had continued down this road, his life would have turned out differently. He had once stood here, younger and full of energy, carrying many images of what might have been. But he chose another direction, not because it was right or wrong, only because, at that moment, it was the only choice he could make. The road remained behind, along with possibilities that were never tested. Years later, Uncle Reed no longer felt sharp regret when he thought of it. Still, on very quiet afternoons, the thought of what if would pass through lightly, not strong enough to hurt, but enough to make him pause a little longer. The road before him today looked the same, showing no sign of waiting or blame. It simply existed, silent, like a possibility that had closed on its own. He stood still, neither stepping forward nor turning away right away. A breeze moved through, carrying the scent of dry grass and warm earth. Uncle Reed realized that this road was not asking him to return. It held no promise, and it did not remind him of what had been lost. It was simply a road that once existed in his life, and now continued to exist, separate from the choice he was living today. Some decisions do not need to be proven right or wrong. They were made, and life continued from there. Uncle Reed could see clearly that over the years, he had lived a full life in his own way. The road he did not take did not make what he had any less meaningful. It was simply a branch that had closed, without judgment. He turned away and walked slowly back toward his present path. There was no sense of closing something, and no rush of relief. Only a familiar calm, like remembering that he had been where he needed to be for a long time now. The road ahead was neither longer nor shorter, just the road that existed in this moment. The light of late afternoon faded as Uncle Reed continued on, no longer carrying the image of the old road as an unanswered question. It remained behind, not abandoned, and not taken along. In that quiet, evening began to open, slow and steady, as if there were nothing more that needed deciding. Uncle Reed returned home as the days softened into night. The light in the room felt no different from other evenings. Everything resting in its usual place. He hung his hat on the wooden hook, poured himself a glass of water, and sat by the window. Outside, the sky deepened in color without urgency, as if night knew it did not need to arrive early. The image of the old road no longer appeared clearly. It felt far away, not behind him, but more like a thought that had been set down. Uncle Reed realized that for many years, he had not truly wanted to return to that road. What made him pause whenever he remembered it was not the desire to continue, but the habit of wondering whether he had missed something. Sitting quietly, he saw that this question had not been necessary for a long time. His life had unfolded fully, with ordinary days, familiar relationships, and calm evenings like this one. There was no empty space waiting to be filled by an old choice. The road not taken did not hold any part of him back, and it did not take anything from the present. His body gradually relaxed as he leaned back in the chair. There was no urge to compare, and no need to imagine different outcomes. What had already happened did not need to be weighed again. When he stopped returning to check, the road naturally became very small, like a detail that had completed its role in a longer story. Sleep arrived slowly, but without obstruction. There were no thoughts that needed to be held for tomorrow, no choices that needed defending, and nothing that needed proving. Rest simply unfolded in a very ordinary way, when the mind was no longer pulled toward branches that had already closed. The quiet reflection drifted through, like the sound of dry leaves brushing the ground as the wind passed. Some roads are not taken, not because they are wrong, but because they finished their purpose long ago. Recognizing that we passed by is enough. There is no need to return, and no need to carry the question of what if into the present. When we stop using old choices to measure the value of the life we are living now, the mind settles naturally. Not because everything is perfect, but because nothing is being compared anymore. And in that absence of comparison, the body feels safe, as if it has finally arrived where it belongs. The small lesson is this: recognizing that you have passed through is enough. There is no need to go back. Evening closes slowly, without a clear ending. Only the sense that everything has been placed where it belongs. The present road continues ahead, without promise, without urgency, and without asking for anything more than to be walked at its own quiet, ordinary pace. Aunt May woke earlier than usual that morning, not because there was anything urgent to do, but because sleep had ended on its own. The kitchen was still dim, light slipping softly through the window frame, just enough to reveal the teapot resting on the wooden table. Inside it remained half a pot of tea from yesterday. The water cooled, the leaves settled at the bottom, the color faded with time. Aunt May looked at it for a while, unhurried, as if she were looking at something very familiar. In the past, she often kept old tea if it was still drinkable, not out of thrift, but out of habit. The tea was still there, not spoiled, with no clear reason to pour it out. But this morning, as her hand touched the teapot, Aunt May did not think of reheating it. She simply noticed that yesterday tea had already completed its purpose, even though it was still intact. She gently poured the cooled tea away, without hesitation and without regret. The liquid flowed quietly into the sink, making no distinct sound. The teapot became empty, lighter somehow, as if it too had been allowed to rest. Aunt May rinsed it with warm water, her movements slow and even, following no particular ritual. She placed fresh tea leaves into the pot, waited for the water to boil, and poured slowly. Steam rose, carrying a soft, familiar scent. Aunt May did not think the new tea would be better than the old, nor did she see pouring it out as an important decision. It was simply a natural movement, like changing out of yesterday clothes even though they were still clean. When she sat down at the table, Aunt May lifted the fresh cup and felt the warmth spread through her fingertips. Outside, the morning began to move at its ordinary pace. Nothing special marked this moment. Yet, in the quiet, she felt her heart grow lighter. Not because something new had been added, but because she was no longer carrying what remained from the day before. Aunt May sipped slowly, not thinking about yesterday and not looking far ahead into today. The tea was warm, just right, with no need to compare it to the cooled pot from before. She noticed how naturally her body responded to what was present, as if it knew there was no need to hold on to old flavors in order to begin a new day. When she set the cup down, Aunt May did not treat the moment as a lesson, nor did she assign it any special meaning. Yet inside her was a very gentle sense that not everything that is still usable needs to be carried forward. Some things have passed, and even if they were not wrong, they do not need to continue with us. The morning moved slowly around Aunt May. After finishing her cup of tea, she did not rush to stand. Warmth still lingered in her hands, and in the small kitchen, everything seemed to be moving at the right pace. There was no strong feeling of beginning a new day, and no sharp separation from the old one. Only a soft continuation, like light gradually filling the room without announcement. Aunt May washed the cup and set it upside down on the wooden rack, then looked again at the teapot, now clean and empty. There was no trace of yesterday tea, yet no sense of loss either. She realized that for many years, she had been used to keeping things that were still usable. Not only tea, but feelings, stories, and lingering traces of yesterday. They were not exactly heavy, but just enough to make each new day begin a little more slowly. She stepped out onto the porch and took in a breath of cool air. The morning was quiet, carrying no specific memory that needed attention. Aunt May did not think of pouring out the old tea as an act of great letting go. It was simply not bringing yesterday remainder into this moment. And when she did not carry it, her body responded naturally, lightly, as if it already knew how to begin from what was here. There are days when we keep old traces, not because they are precious, but because they are familiar. We fear that if we let them go, an empty space will appear that needs to be filled. But Aunt May saw that the space did not demand anything. It simply opened so that something new could arrive in an ordinary way. Like an empty teapot, it does not need to prove what it once held. It only needs to be ready for fresh water. Time passed, and that light feeling remained. Not a clear joy, and not a release, but a small ease, just enough so the day was not dragged down by what had already cooled. Aunt May did not think about applying this to everything in her life. She only noticed that, at least this morning, she did not need to carry yesterday's cup of tea with her. The quiet reflection dissolved naturally, like the faint scent of tea lingering in the air after the pot has been washed clean. Some things are not wrong and not broken, but their time has passed. When we keep them out of habit, we bring the residue of yesterday into the present. And when we allow ourselves to begin again from what is here, not through effort, but through a very gentle movement, the body naturally feels lighter. Letting go in this case is not throwing something away, and not denying it either. It is simply recognizing that today does not need to carry yesterday flavor. Like tea that has cooled, even if it is still drinkable, it no longer fits the new morning. When we stop holding on to what has passed, the present gains space to unfold on its own. The small lesson is this: today does not need to carry the taste of yesterday. The morning continues without needing a clear ending. There is only soft light, a quiet kitchen, and the feeling that everything has been set down at the right time, allowing the new day to begin gently, in its own way. Leora does not appear in the way people usually expect. There are no footsteps, no calling voice, only a very subtle feeling as the moon rises just a little higher than on other nights. Clouds drift slowly across the sky, sometimes thick, sometimes thin, leaving uneven shadows on the ground below. Leora is there, inseparable from the moonlight, and not hidden by the clouds either, as if the two have never been in conflict at all. People often believe that the moon is blocked by clouds, that its light disappears when the sky is not clear. But Leora sees something different. The moon does not remember the clouds that pass by. It does not collect darkness, and it does not store dimness. When the clouds move on, the moon simply continues to shine, no brighter, no weaker, as if nothing has happened. Tonight, the clouds come and go very slowly. At times, the moon almost vanishes from sight, leaving only a faint halo of light. But Leora does not change her place. She does not wait for the clouds to clear, and she does not try to break through them. The moonlight remains whole within itself, even when human eyes cannot see it clearly. Below, everything is quiet. Rooftops, trees, and narrow paths rest in uneven light, sometimes clear, sometimes blurred. Nothing complains about this. The night continues, not stopping because the light is interrupted. Leora observes it all, not with eyes, but with a very gentle presence. Some people look up and wait for the clouds to pass so they can see the moon more clearly. They believe that only when the sky is empty does the light become complete. But Leora knows that the moon does not need to be clearly seen in order to exist. Light does not depend on whether it is blocked or not. It simply is, continuing to be itself no matter what passes in front of it. The clouds keep moving, their shapes constantly changing. Some are dense, some are thin, some dissolve before they can fully cover the moon. But no cloud stays long enough to become part of the moon. They arrive, they pass, and they fade, leaving no trace behind. Leora remains still within this movement, not interfering and not waiting. To her, the sky does not need to be clear for the night to be complete. The moon does not need to defeat darkness in order to remain present. It only needs to not remember what briefly covered it. Somewhere far below, people begin to feel the night grow deeper. Not because the moon shines brighter, but because they are no longer waiting for the clouds to clear. When waiting stops, the light naturally becomes enough in its own quiet way. The night continues without needing anything else to happen. Clouds still come and go, but the distance between them and the moon no longer seems important. Leora does not track each cloud, nor does she check whether the sky is clear or dull. She is there, within the soft light, as if there were nothing that needed to be remembered. The moon does not change when the clouds leave. It does not brighten to make up for being covered, and it does not weaken because it was just hidden. It simply remains the moon of this night, carrying no trace of moments that have already passed. Leora knows this is what keeps the moonlight, not because it was never covered, but because it does not hold on to what covered it Below, people gradually stop looking up to check the sky. When they no longer wait for a perfect sky, the feeling of night becomes more complete. Light does not need to be clear to be allowed to exist. It can be faint, scattered, uneven, and still be enough for night to continue being night. Leora stands within that wide space where there is no opposition between light and darkness. Clouds are not enemies of the moon, nor are they something that must be chased away. They are simply natural movements of the sky, appearing and dissolving, leaving no trace. When they are no longer treated as a problem, they naturally become very light. There are times when people believe their minds have been covered by too many things from the past. Memories, emotions, and brief shadows are held as if they have changed something essential inside. But Leora sees something else. The mind does not remember what briefly covered it. When it is not pulled back by attention, everything naturally passes, like clouds drifting away from the moon. Tonight, there is no sudden brightness and no moment of realization. There is only a very even, very spacious settling. When there is no longer a wish for the sky to be different, the moonlight becomes enough in a very ordinary way. And in that enoughness, there is nothing that needs fixing, and nothing that needs to be held. The quiet understanding dissolves, like the moonlight itself, not trying to explain anything, simply being there. In Buddhism, there is a very gentle recognition that the mind does not need to carry what once covered it. Just as the moon does not remember the clouds, the mind does not need to store moments of dimness. When remembering stops, light continues naturally, uninterrupted by what has passed. Letting go here is not forcing oneself to forget, and not pushing anything away. Letting go is simply not calling the old clouds back again. When we stop returning to check whether the sky is clear enough, the night naturally grows deeper. And in that depth, everything is allowed to rest without needing any further condition. The small lesson is this: the mind too does not need to carry what once covered it. There is no clear ending to this night. The moon continues its path across the sky. Clouds continue to arrive and leave, and a wide quiet opens, spacious enough for everything to dissolve into it, as lightly as if it had never been covered at all. After all the stories you have just listened to, perhaps the gentlest thing tonight is not that you have understood something new, but that you no longer need to carry anything more. No one in these stories tried to fix the past, and no one attempted to make what had already happened more beautiful. Everything simply slowed down, very softly, like an object being placed back where it belongs. Without announcement, without needing to prove anything. The past by itself does not have the ability to stay. It only remains when it is called back, when it is carried along, when it is brought into bed with us each night. When that calling stops, not because we are forcing ourselves to forget, but because there is no longer a need, the past naturally moves farther away. It does not disappear, and it is not erased. It simply no longer steps into the present. Buddhism does not teach us to let go perfectly, and it does not ask us to become someone else. It gently reminds us that everything has its own time. There were questions that were once necessary, memories that were once very real, and waiting that once ran very deep. But when their time has passed, continuing to carry them only makes the night longer, not life deeper. Letting go in these stories is not an action. Letting go is a stopping. Stopping the reliving, stopping the checking, stopping the waiting, stopping the carrying. And when nothing is being held through effort anymore, the mind naturally widens, like the sky that does not need to do anything for clouds to pass. Now, there is nothing more that needs to be understood. The night is deep enough. The body has already recognized the familiar signal of safety. And in this very gentle space, sleep does not need to be searched for. It only needs to be allowed to arrive in its own quiet way, as light as everything that has just been set down. Let your body soften again just a little more. Let your breath drift in and drift out, like ripples moving across a quiet lake at night. Let your forehead ease. Your eyes go soft. Your jaw melt without effort. Down the shoulders. Let them sink the way water settles after a gentle breeze. Arms, wrists, fingers, all falling into stillness. Your chest opening, your belly calming, your hips, thighs, knees softening like sand under warm moonlight. And finally, your feet, growing warm, easy, quiet. Imagine the moon slowly lowering itself toward the surface of a silent lake. Its light touching the water, then touching you. Soft, round, understanding. Let it rest on your shoulders. Let it rest on your breath. As if it's saying, you can stop now. You've done enough for today. Feel your chest release. Your mind settle. Your whole body wrapped in a glow. So gentle, nothing needs to be fixed or held. Now imagine your awareness drifting like a small boat, gliding into the open night. Stars above you. The lake behind you. Everything widening. Everything turning quiet. You become lighter. The sky becomes deeper. And both dissolve into each other. Like starlight touching water. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for giving yourself this soft space. Let sleep come slowly, naturally, like moonlight sinking into water. And if you'd like to return to this calm every night, you can follow the Sleepy Zen channel so we can meet again in moments just like this. Sleep well. Sleep well.